Answers Party Line this morning here on Chasm Radio. Brad Wenz, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting us in here today, and we really appreciate this opportunity to talk about what we've been doing on Dan Lai's farm here for the last 3 years. What we did out there is we worked with Dan to apply for a Minnesota Department of Ag grant. These are called the Sustainable Ag Demonstration Grant. And what we did on his farm out there, the title of the grant was the Evaluation of Winter Annual Small Grain Cover Crops for Forage Production. And I guess this whole idea started back in about 2014. We found out about these grants offered by the Minnesota Department of Ag, and really what they're set up for is for farmers and researchers to do a short-term grant to look at things that we can do on the farm to improve the economics, improve sustainability of the farm. Fairly short-term grants. They don't have to be research. And so we knew that we needed to get more of the economic information out there to farmers for cover crops. It's been recognized as one of the chief roadblocks to establishment of cover crops, getting these things out in the fields. We need more economic information for farmers, at least in the short term. And so I guess the idea, I think, was probably first thought of by Megan Herbst in our office, I think, and Katie Breath. They kind of came up with this. They said, let's look at these winter annual small grains and see if we know they're good cover crops. They're planted in the fall. They harvest carbon. They prevent erosion. And let's look at maybe harvesting these things in the spring for silage to get some value added out there to improve the economics. So we talked to Dan. Dan had already done a couple grants on his farm, and he was experienced in these things. He had the no-till drill and a lot of experience with planting cover crops and knew a lot about soil health. So we presented this to Dan, and he said, yeah, we did some work with winter triticale, and it was tremendous forage. But we need, if we look at some of the other things, maybe look at cereal rye and some of the other winter annual small grains, maybe there's something else out there that would be more economical. So yeah, let's go ahead and do this. And so we applied for this grant for the Minnesota Department of Ag, and the way we set it up was he's got a 12-acre field there right next to his driveway, and we actually set it up in 5 roughly equal-sized strips, and the strips are planted into 4 different winter annual cover crops or small grains, and then the 5th strip is a check strip, and we're comparing the yields and the cost of the small grains with the check strip. And we decided to go with cereal rye, winter triticale, spelt, and winter wheat as our test small grains out there. And we went ahead and started planting these things. Dan planted the first crop in 2015, and we tracked the yields of the small grains. We tracked the yields of the production crop following the small grain, and plus physical and chemical changes in the soil over time. And I can't forget the partners, I guess, in the grant project. We partnered with Ag Resources Consulting over there. James Schrepfer from Ag Resources Consulting did all the soil testing. And then we also worked with Greenwald Elevator, John Dockendorf over there, and they provided the seed for the grant. And, of course, Minnesota Extension, Dan Martins helped us quite a bit with some of the economic data.
So how many small grains did you have to select from to narrow things down?
Well, we worked a little bit with, was it Paul Johnson, I think, is your small grain specialist?
Joachim Wiersma or Doug Holen?
Yeah, I think might have been Paul. I don't remember now.
Okay.
But back in 2014, we worked with Extension. You know, which winter small grains should we be looking at here, and which ones might give us the forage value? Spelt is kind of my idea.
Okay.
It's an ancient relative of wheat, and it's organic farmers are looking at spelt a little bit now because it's a small grain that when you harvest it, it's still got the husk on the grain. It's not a free thrashing grain like regular wheat is. And organic farmers are looking at spelt a little bit more now for it's a little bit more, I guess they say, a little more disease resistant. It stores better because that husk is on there. You don't have the nutrient loss and storage. Plus, it's a little bit more adaptable to soils that maybe poorer soils with less fertility. And it's a conversation piece. Everybody asks what spelt is, so we start talking about spelt, and then we start talking about cover crops, with that.
Yeah.
But and then winter wheat. So these are the four we decided on trying. This is not research, I guess. This is just a demonstration. We did not replicate the plots. But it did open some eyes and answered some questions that we had, and I think we've got some pretty interesting economic data.
Did you all come to a consensus at one time on to what four you wanted to plant, or was it? I know you said that was your idea, Brad, for that one. Dan had some positive experience with the triticale, so we knew we wanted to try that one. Mm-hmm. And he had planted a winter or a cereal rye, on his land before. And that's kind of a workhorse. That one always seems to grow well. So we knew we wanted those two. Okay.
And then I'd heard that winter wheat had some pretty good forage value, and so we went with those. There's others, I guess. What other ones could we have chosen there, Dan?
Those are the ones I'd be thinking about primarily in terms of what's commonly grown here.
Winter barley, I guess, is another one, but I wish we had more time. We could try some different things.
So the grant so then what happens? I know we're going to talk about this more thoroughly, but since this grant now is done this year, right? 2017.
Yep, we finished up this year, and we're starting to get this information out. It's going to be the results are going to be published in what they call the Green Book, and we already had a kind of an introduction to the grant in the 2016 publication. But the final results will come out with this year's Green Book.
We'll talk more about what you found here, what we can talk about here this morning in just a few minutes because we got to take a break. Got some news coming up. We'll talk more about the evaluation of winter annual small grain cover crops for forage production that was planted on the farm of Dan Lai. Dan Lai is also with us this morning. Dan Martins, as well as Brad Wenz, and also Rick Berscheid is here, and Dennis Fuchs on Chasm Radio. As we continue more Answers Party Line, we'll take a break for some news from the Minnesota News Network. We'll take a look at some weather and more Answers Party Line. It's 9:30 Minnesota News Network news information right now. It is Chasm Radio. More Answers Party Line here on Chasm Radio. We're visiting with Brad Wenz from the SWCD office. We have Extension Educator Dan Martins in studio, and also we've got farmer Dan Lai with us. And Dan's farm was used as an evaluation field for testing some cover crops, some small grain cover crops in the last 3 years. You planted, Brad, you said once again you planted 4 strips, 1 check strip. Of what were the crops again?
The crops were, starting with the north strip, was cereal rye. The second strip was winter triticale. The third strip was spelt, which is an ancient relative of wheat. And the fourth strip was winter wheat. And then the fifth strip on the south side was our check. And all the strips are a little over 2 acres. The whole field is about 12. And I can't talk about a project without mentioning the soil types a little bit, because that's real important, I think. These are outwash sands, sandy soils that have a sandy loam surface, and that surface might be 16 to 24 inches thick out there, and these most of it's pretty well drained. I wouldn't say we got real wet soils out there, but these are sands, and so that gives us a little bit more of a challenge, I guess. And that's a good thing, because we need to look at cover crops on the sandy soils also.
And you're working with Dan Lai because you had worked with him previously in other grant opportunities, right?
Yeah, Dan has been. We worked with Dan on a grant in 2013 and 2014 to evaluate different methods of seeding cereal rye, and we've got that was actually pure research that was done. With Jody DeYoung Hughes from the University of Minnesota Extension. And then we also looked at cover crop, what we call cocktail mixes, up to 8 or 9 species of different cover crops planted in September. So we've got all that grant information in our office. If anybody's interested in talking to us about some of those results, it's pretty interesting information from there. So, but and Dan has been doing. He's been no-till on his farm for many years, and he's been planting cover crops in his land out there. So it was a perfect fit for this grant.
I'll put the mic over to Dan once. So Dan, when you were talked to about doing this, what was your response?
Oh, I was all in. I learned a lot the first time we worked with them, and it was something I had tried this once in the past, growing actually with cereal rye for forage in the spring, so it was something I was kind of interested too, but didn't know any of the numbers either, so that's kind of where this came about.
Was it kind of, we'll talk about the results here in just a few seconds, but is it what you expected?
Yes and no. There was some things we weren't expecting, but pretty much kind of what I had known is the cereal rye, that'll always overwinter, but that's kind of one of the biggest problems with any cover crop is you're going to spend the money. What is it going to live through the winter? Is it going to grow enough in the fall? And that's what we kind of found out. The first year it worked pretty good, other than the spelt, and this last year everything winter killed for the most part, except for the rye. So
I was going to ask you, how did the climate itself, or the weather that was the last 3 years, how did that affect the results? Was that something that you had to kind of factor in?
Yeah, well, that's Minnesota, right?
Just kind of go with the flow.
Yeah, and that's, how do you know? Last winter, too, 60 degrees. You thought, well, maybe it'll be better than the winter before, because we had a stretch in January the year before, too, where everything was bare and it still came through, but this last winter, even the triticale was way down. And
do any of the cover crops have a little, I don't know, for lack of a better term, leeway when it comes to the climate and the temperature of what happens over the winter?
We'd probably agree that the winter rye is probably the most durable and the most tolerant to adverse weather conditions compared to the others that we've looked at. And Brad, Dan, you'd agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, tell us what you found. Tell us the results here.
Okay, well, I guess the first thing you look at is yield, right? And first, let's go back to when we planted some of these things. The planting was done in the fall. We planted all the strips for the first time in 2015, and I believe the previous crop there was corn, wasn't it?
Yes,
Dan?
corn silage. Yeah.
Corn silage. And they were planted the first year in early November, 11/4. Yeah, it looks like all the strips were planted in the 4th of November in 2015. And they all came up well. I mean, even planted that late, it's amazing how well these things come up. That doesn't happen every year, but it worked pretty good that year. And even in the spring, that in 2015, the crops looked pretty good. As far as yields, in the first harvesting was done in 2015 on May 16th. I guess was it May 16th or May 18th? In that period, over a couple days, they harvested they all look fairly good. The cereal rye went 6 tons per acre, and this is wet tons. And then the triticale went 4.2, the spelt went 1.8, and the winter wheat went 2.9. Now,
Might chip in, Brad, just the dry matter yield on that was 2 ton an acre for the dry matter and the rye, 1.51 on the triticale, 0.68 on the spelt, and 1.35 on the winter wheat.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of a challenge to when you harvest these things because you can't wait too long. The rye was in the boot stage and just almost ready to the flower, almost ready to seed head, almost ready to emerge from the stem. You don't want to wait too much longer after that because feed value just bottoms out after that. And then some of these others might be a little bit later maturing, like the spelt I think is a little bit later maturing. So I think if in a a real life situation where you had a lot of acres that you might have waited a little bit longer on some of these other ones, like the spelt and the winter wheat possibly. So the comparison is good, but it could have been better, I think, in a larger production system.
Yeah, because you said you did all at the same time, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
We try to harvest everything pretty much the same time, because that's the other challenge, is that we need to get out there and plant a production crop as soon as these come off. And that was an advantage that Dan had, because he's all no-till out there. So he was able to just simply go right in there and no-till that production crop in, which saved several days here.
Mm-hmm.
So then in 2016, then the production crop was soybeans. And I don't think the soybeans were too bad. They were planted, planted on the 24th of May in 2016. And the cereal rye went 44.6 bushel per acre. Now this is the soybeans following the cereal rye, 44.6, 41.3 following the winter triticale. The spelt went 46. And the interesting about the spelt, the production crops after the spelt were higher in both years. And I'm not real sure why. Possibly because maybe the total yield on the spelt was a little less. I don't know what the difference was there. And then the winter wheat went 35.6, and the check was 42.8. Now, statistically, I can't say that these are really that much different. But I think what we can say is here, when we look at the yields, 44, 46 versus 43 on the check, we didn't see a decline in the yields. I think that's the biggest point we can make here. We didn't see a decline in the soybean yields compared to the check plot.
But you can't determine which had the best yield there after the cover crop was harvested, the different samples. You can't tell which one worked the best prior to the regular crop.
Well, again, this is a short-term study, and it wasn't replicated. I think if we had a few more years and we did the replication, we'd probably have some pretty good numbers. But another issue we had out here in this site was variable soil types. I mean, it was there would be you could, in one strip you could have sand, and then down the end of the strip you might have more sandy loam or maybe loam textures, and it varied quite a bit around the field. So, but a replicated plot would have taken away some of that variability.
So then, how do you come up with any kind of valid determination when you have you got the soil temperature, soil makeup variations? You've got you harvested everything at the same time, but it should have been, in a real life situation, different times. Since you have all these variables, how can you come up with something that's going to be validated down the line as this is what's going to happen when we do it next time?
Yeah, well, you don't. I guess, the weather conditions change, from year to year. And I don't think, the purpose of this grant wasn't to give us hard numbers, I don't think. Just to show us, maybe get an idea what we can expect out there. We know that it's going to be different on every farm situation. And to get people out and talking about cover crops and soil health. I mean, that's the other big part of this thing. And to show people that maybe we can, at least in the short term, we can see some economic benefits of planting these things if they're equipped to harvest the silage.
I think with this particular grant program, the way I understand it from Department of Ag, it gives a farmer a chance to try something they're curious about, try something that probably based on some past experience that they've had or things they've seen in other farms, gives them a chance to get on their own farm and try something and just see whether there's reason to think it could work. And so, and if you saw on your farm that you think a particular crop or particular cropping system has value, then you work with that on your own farm. You're a good student of what you're doing, and you see what you can do with it. If you want to take and translate that to other farms and see what other farms might be able to do with it, then maybe you see results in a demonstration project kind of a sense that say, hey, there's a reason to take a closer look at this, and so maybe we ought to ask the university or on a given farm, maybe we ought to design a more research-based kind of a format for taking a closer, harder look at how the thing plays out. I think for Dan on his own farm, this was an opportunity to look at some crops that he had grown for some other cover crop work that he had done, and to take a look at something on his own farm to see whether it had reason to think it was workable. And if you think it's got reason to be workable, then you work more with it on your own farm and you study how it plays out for you. You think about those other variables, the weather, the soils in given years, and what factors drive that, and how do I think that plays out from my experience over past years in terms of weather and soils and kinds of things, and sort out what I think has the best fit on my farm. And again, if you want to take it to other farms, then you might think about doing them. You might see value in doing a more designed research type thing that might answer the question: is this predictable? Can we predict, or can we rely that this would be repeatable on other farms or not? And then you would take it to some other sites and do more work with it. But initially, you're just getting a sense: is this workable for me? Does this fit my system? Is this something I want to spend more time working with this? And I think that's the answer that Dan was looking for here. And so maybe, Dan, what's your sense from this? Did you see something here that says there's something here that works? There's something here that's worth me spending more time on and looking at more closely to fine tune and work with on my farm situation.
Yes, and right now this year I put in 15 acres to do this on my own, and I basically been using it for young stock, and I have a small herd of beef cattle, so I'm going ahead with that. In this actual field I've seeded in, and the plan is to try to graze it in the springs and try that out once. But a lot of times I was working with cover crops since 2008 anyway, so that's where we kind of moved into, can we use it for forage? And I mean, you're using up more nutrients if you're taking the crop off, as opposed to just what I would do with the other cover crops, is spray it dead and plant into it. But we still saw some benefits even in the row crops. Even when we took the corn silage off this year, we still had, the ground was still covered with the residue from these, so that was another benefit. So
I think part of what we saw this year over the last 2 years with the plots, and Dan, you chip in if this makes sense to you, I think we saw that rye, in terms of the cover crops that we used out there in the fall, the rye, the triticale, the spelt, and the wheat, the rye clearly looked to be the best. Probably in terms of yield, probably also in terms of the fit on the land, in terms of probably the crop that's ready to come off earlier than the others to get on with planting the regular crop. When we look at the cost and the value of the crop that we got off it, it was clearly better. I think that's partly because the rye yielded better, clearly, than the other three crops. And the seed cost for rye is also significantly less, and that really plays into the economics of how that turns out also. So rye looked really the most reliable here. Last winter, the other three crops, the triticale and the spelt and the wheat, all kind of took a hit with the winter, like Dan said earlier. The rye endured last year's winter weather a lot better. So rye really looked to be more reliable, more economical in terms of lower seed cost and in more yield. We sometimes talk about triticale being a little better feed quality, spelt wheat maybe also sometimes being a little better feed quality, but the yield really kind of trumps that when you look at a significant difference in yield. And so that might play out different years, different winter weather, different farming situations, but I think here we saw that rye is, and I think most people would agree that generally rye is going to be your most reliable choice. If you're doing something for the first time and you want to have a good experience the first time, then rye is often what we talk about using. That's probably where you're going to get your best chance to get a positive result, and then you can work from there to see whether other things are worth taking a look at as well.
The makeup of the soil, did it do anything biologically different, or did it change the makeup? Or?
That would be Brad's arena.
Yeah, thanks for talking about that. We looked at a lot of different things here besides just yield and forage value on these. We also wanted to track some of the physical and chemical changes in the soil. We partnered with Ag Resources Consulting right here out of Albany, and we worked with James Schrepfer there, and he every year he went out there and took soil samples from each strip, and we looked at standards series nutrient tests. He also did the Haney soil health tool test, which uses more of a natural extractant out there, and maybe looks at more organically available nutrients in the soil, and it's a good way to track changes in total carbon and some of the other factors we look at regarding soil health. And one thing James told me yesterday, he said, Dan is doing such a good job out there, we didn't see a lot of changes in soil carbon or some of those other indicators of soil health. And there certainly was no decline in any of those things. So we didn't see a lot of changes there. Another thing that James said that he thought was interesting is that there was, when it comes to the soybeans, there was no decline in the yields of soybeans following these winter cover crops planted. And he also, one thing he said, and we don't have, I guess, a lot of data that proves this, but manure application. And a lot of people are criticizing over application of manure at times, and maybe cover crops grown in a fall like this would capture some of those nutrients that are in manure and hold them a little bit longer on some of these sandy soils, and mitigate and keep some of these things from moving down through the soil profile, especially nitrates from the manure. So maybe it's a way to stabilize nutrient loss from manure. One thing we get a lot of questions about soil moisture following winter small grains are planted. People think it's going to be so dry because these things are actively growing, when they're terminated in the spring, and there's a lot of concern about dryness and really dry conditions following these crops. And so we did track soil moisture, and specifically the moisture right around planting of the production crop. That's a critical time. And in 2016, we did see that the cover crops were just a little drier than the check strip, but it took a little while for it to catch up. But once the rainfall started coming stronger later on in the season, it did catch up. But it did lag. The soil moisture did lag a little bit further behind on the cover crops versus the check strip, but it didn't seem to affect the yields. We still had pretty good yields out there, and the yields were consistent from the cover crops to the check strip. In 2017, it's kind of a strange year for moisture. It was real dry in Dan's place in April. I think they only got about 0.6 of an inch. And the cover crops were slightly drier, but right away in June, right after planting, it caught up. So the soil moisture was almost identical between the cover crop strips and the check strips in 2017. And I think part of that is because he's no-tilling out there and there's a lot of residue on the surface, so we're not seeing as much moisture loss. But that is a concern. So I think leaving residue on the surface, especially if you're no-tilling, will take away some of those problems that people might see with dryness following these winter small grains.
What if you don't do the no-till option?
If they don't do the no-till option, well, that one of the principles, I think, of soil health is to try to leave the surface covered with residue, at least to some extent. I mean, it's important. And this just kind of, if you're going to try the winter small grains like this and grown for forage, or even just simply turning them under for just the organic matter, it would help to leave some residue. Mm-hmm. Now the winter small grains themselves will provide that residue cover if they're not tilled down in the spring. But it does help to have the residue cover in the surface.
Okay. So
and there are other conservation tillage practices that allow you to leave a fair amount of residue on the surface also, where it helps in some of the same ways.
Yeah, I mean, people nowadays, I think, are probably. I don't see a lot of moldboard plowing out there, and we're seeing a lot of the vertical tillage and chisel systems. They're leaving some residue. Yeah, as long as you don't harvest it for forage, we're seeing a lot of that now, baling up the corn stalks and so on. But if you want to improve the soil organic matter and soil health, I think it's important to leave some of those residues out there.
So after all this, we can safely say it's a confidence booster. Farmers should check into it more. And this whole option with the cereal rice sounds like, Dan, you can't go wrong with that. It kind of opens up, like you said, the conversation and gives you the confidence to maybe this is something you want to pursue.
Yeah, and I think it'd also be useful for Dan to comment about on his farm with crops and livestock where this spring harvested forage fits into his livestock operation.
Yeah, and that's one thing for me. I'm looking more for young stock feed and that, so that's where the rye fits in. Or if you're looking more for dairy quality, then you maybe want to try to, if you can get the triticale in early enough, mid-September, then that's a better option, maybe even winter wheat because it'll have a better feed value, more digestible. But for me, that's kind of where I'd like to have the feed is more for the young stock and the beef herd. And then one other thing people got to keep in mind too is when your next crop you're rotating to. For me, I use that behind corn silage. That's always my barest ground, so it works good to seed that. I can drill that in then, and it provides ground cover, and I kind of basically use that then for my forage in the spring, and then I'll rotate to soybeans, and that fits in much better following the rye, where we have had issues following rye with corn. For 1 year we had army worms, and even last year it's a little more clumpy. It's harder to plant for the no-till system anyway. That's to plant into it. Or the soybeans are a little more forgiving.
All right. For more information, they can contact Soil and Water Conservation District, Brad?
Sure. Yeah, contact our office. We'd be more than happy to talk about all the results of the grant. Again, it's going to be published in the I believe the 2017 edition of the Green Book. We're not sure when that's going to come out. Either 2017. Plus. If you want to come in the office, we can go through both the grant that the demonstration we did on Dan's farm back in 2013-14 and talk more about this one. We've got a lot more information we could share regarding the 2017 yields and some of the other physical and chemical information. And, we'd be glad to talk about more of this stuff.
Very good. Brad Wynn, Soil and Water Conservation District. We also have Dan Martins, Extension Educator, with us. Farmer Dan Light telling us his experience with that evaluation cover crop. And also in the background, photographers, Rick Berscheid and also Mr. Dennis Fuchs back there with the camera.
Thanks a lot, Brad.
Thank you so much. It is CAS Radio, 2 minutes past 10. We've got news coming up.